The humidity hanging over the valley was thick enough to chew. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the aftermath of a severe July derecho had left the entire borough in total blackout. I was 40 feet up in the fiberglass bucket of my utility truck, sweat stinging my eyes as I wrestled with a blown transformer on the primary pole behind the old municipal hall. The storm had ripped through the county like a freight train, tearing down ancient oaks and snapping utility poles like dry kindling. For the past 18 hours, I had been running on black coffee and adrenaline, moving from grid to grid, splicing lines and resetting breakers. My name is Warren. For 12 years, I have managed the electrical infrastructure for this town. I deal in copper, voltage, load limits, and physical reality. When a high-tension line snaps in a storm, I climb up and splice it back together. When a substation breaker trips due to a massive surge, I go in and manually reset the heavy iron switches. There is absolutely no magic in electricity. It is a fundamental force of nature, but it is predictable. It follows the path of least resistance. It obeys the strict, unyielding laws of physics. If there is no continuous circuit, there is no power. It is that simple. I clamped my heavy, insulated rubber grips onto the primary line, locking the thick gauge wire into the new fuse cutout. These gloves are rated to handle 10,000 volts, which makes them incredibly thick and clumsy to work in, but they are the only thing standing between me and a closed casket funeral. Below me, the town was a sea of absolute ink. There were no streetlights, no porch lamps, no neon signs humming from the diner down the block. There was just the heavy oppressive silence that always follows a massive summer storm, broken only by the low, steady idle of my truck's diesel engine echoing off the wet brick alleyway. I reached for the radio clipped to the shoulder of my high-visibility vest, pressing the heavy toggle switch with my thumb. "Boyd, you on?" Static hissed through the small speaker, thick and full of atmospheric interference, before the dispatcher's tired voice broke through. "Copy. Warren, tell me you have got some good news for me. The nursing home over on 4th Street is running on a diesel backup generator that sounds like it is coughing up a lung. The overnight staff is calling every 10 minutes asking when the grid is coming back online." "I am almost there," I said, wiping a streak of dirty sweat from my forehead with the back of my thick rubber glove. "I am closing the circuit for the municipal block right now. Once this transformer is live, it should daisy chain down the line and feed straight into 4th Street. Tell them to hang tight for about 60 seconds. Stand by." I grabbed the 8-foot fiberglass hot stick from the bracket inside the bucket. It is a specialized tool, a long insulated pole with a metal hook on the end, designed to let a lineman safely engage high-voltage equipment from a distance. I hooked the metal ring on the heavy ceramic fuse door, braced my boots against the floor of the bucket, and slammed the door shut with a solid, practiced thrust. A loud, sharp crack echoed off the brick walls of the alleyway as the main circuit finally closed. Instantly, the amber sodium streetlights lining the avenue flickered, buzzed with a deep electrical hum, and bathed the wet asphalt below in a sickly, familiar orange glow. A few security lights flicked on behind the municipal building, cutting harsh geometric shadows across the empty parking lot. "Let there be light," I muttered to myself, lowering the fiberglass hot stick and feeling a brief, satisfying wave of accomplishment wash over my exhaustion. Before I could reach for my radio to confirm the successful connection with Boyd, the fiberglass bucket beneath my heavy work boots began to vibrate. It was not a mechanical shudder from the truck's hydraulic arm. I know every rattle and hum that vehicle makes. This was a deep, resonant tremor in the air itself. It felt like the heavy, physical bass you experience when a massive freight train rolls past, vibrating the fluid in your chest cavity. The problem was, there were no active train tracks within 10 miles of this valley. The air pressure around me seemed to suddenly drop, making my ears pop as if I had just rapidly descended a steep mountain road. Then, the siren started. It sat on the flat, sun-baked tar roof of the old municipal hall, about 30 yards away from my elevated bucket. It was a massive Federal signal thunderbolt, a terrifyingly large relic from the height of the Cold War. It consisted of a huge, rusted yellow metal horn mounted on a heavy, square iron box. The entire assembly was bolted to a thick concrete pedestal that rose up from the center of the roof. To my knowledge, that specific siren had not been utilized since a civil defense drill back in 1983. The borough had switched to modern, digital pole-mounted sirens decades ago. The thunderbolt was just a forgotten piece of local history, left up there to rust in the rain and gather pigeon droppings. Deep inside the heavy iron housing, the massive mechanical rotor began to grind. It sounded absolutely agonizing, like two rusted brake drums scraping against each other without a drop of lubrication. It was a slow, tortured, rhythmic grinding that steadily increased in speed. I could hear the massive intake vent sucking in the humid night air, forcing the heavy internal chopper to spin against decades of accumulated friction. I frowned, immediately reaching for my radio. The municipal circuit I had just closed shouldn't have been connected to that roof mount. The grid maps were incredibly specific. As the rusted rotor picked up speed, the agonizing grinding sound leveled out into a low, deafening, mechanical groan. But it did not wail. A mechanical siren is a relatively simple piece of machinery. It works by using an electric motor to spin a heavy metal cylinder full of vertical slots inside a stationary housing that also has slots. As the internal cylinder spins, it chops the air being forced through it, creating sound waves. Because of this purely mechanical nature, a siren can only produce a rising and falling pitch. It can go high, and it can go low. It cannot articulate. It cannot form consonants. It physically cannot speak. But the pitch coming from the municipal roof did not rise smoothly. The heavy motor stuttered. It dragged against its own momentum, accelerated sharply, choked on the airflow, and dragged again, manipulating the air displacement with impossible, deliberate precision. The mechanical groan warped and bent, twisting the massive sound waves into a distorted, drawn-out shape that hit me like a physical blow. The sound washed over me, heavy, oppressive, and thick. The hairs on my arms stood up, pushing against the fabric of my long-sleeved work shirt. It wasn't from static electricity in the air. It was a sudden, sharp, metallic spike of pure adrenaline flooding my nervous system. It was my name. It was being pushed through a rusted iron lung, shouted across the dark valley by a machine that had no vocal cords, no digital components, and no logical reason to be operating. My brain immediately scrambled for a rational explanation. Acoustic pareidolia is a documented psychological phenomenon. The human brain is hardwired to find recognizable patterns in random data. It is why people see faces in the clouds, or hear muffled voices in the static of a running shower or the hum of a window air conditioner. But this was not white noise. This was not a random fluctuating pitch. The mechanical stuttering was too precise. The airflow was being deliberately choked and released to form the hard R and the resonant N. I hit the toggle on my radio, my thumb pressing down so hard the plastic casing creaked. "Boyd, are you hearing this?" "Hearing what?" Boyd asked, his voice crackling through the small speaker. "Did the grid hold?" "The board is showing green on my end, but the nursing home is still calling." "The old thunderbolt on the municipal roof," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the massive yellow horn. The metal housing was vibrating so violently now that I could see the rust flaking off and dancing on the tar roof below. It just spun up when I closed the circuit. There was a long, heavy pause on the radio. When Boyd finally spoke again, His voice was entirely stripped of its usual night shift lethargy. The bored, cynical dispatcher was gone. "Warren, that is not funny. I am looking at the digital grid map right now. I have the historical overlays pulled up. The municipal circuit is live, yeah. But the roof siren is not on the grid." "I am looking right at it, Boyd. It is spinning. It is loud as hell, and it is." I stopped myself. I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell another grown man that an iron box was calling my name. "It is malfunctioning. The rotor is stuttering." "Warren," Boyd said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a tight, strained quality. "It is not just off the grid. The borough officially decommissioned that specific unit in October of 1983. I was working dispatch the week they did it. They didn't just pull the breaker in the basement. They went up to the roof and physically severed the conduit. There is zero copper running from the building to that three-phase motor. It is physically impossible for that machine to have power." I stared at the rusted yellow horn. The rotor was spinning so fast now that the air around the intake vent was visibly rippling, pulling the thick humidity into a tight, swirling vortex. If there was no electricity turning the motor, then the heavy iron chopper was being driven entirely by an immense, high-pressure updraft of air coming from inside the concrete pedestal itself. The mechanical voice dragged out again, louder this time. The sheer acoustic weight of it vibrated the bones in my jaw and rattled the heavy steel tools hanging from my leather belt. "Why?" The sound wasn't just loud, it felt heavy, like deep water pressing against my eardrums. My stomach dropped against my belt. I am a pragmatic man. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not believe in the supernatural. When a machine operates, it requires a power source. If the electrical conduit was severed, something else was driving that rotor. And whatever was forcing that much air up through the concrete pillar was manipulating the mechanical governor to form syllables. "Boyd," I said, my mouth suddenly bone dry, my eyes fixed on the dark opening of the yellow horn. "Call the firehouse. Tell them to bring a ladder truck to the municipal alley. I am going onto the roof." Boyd's voice crackled back through the speaker, a sharp burst of static followed by a stammering protest. "Warren, hold on a second. You can't just..." I didn't let him finish. I reached down to the heavy plastic casing of the radio clipped to my vest and twisted the volume dial all the way to the left until it clicked off. The sudden absence of the radio's low background hiss left me alone with the deafening, grinding roar of the siren above. I didn't have the patience to stand in a bucket 40 feet in the air and argue protocols with a dispatcher sitting in a climate-controlled room on the other side of the county. The volunteer fire department was good, but they were currently scattered across 3 different zip codes running chainsaws to clear downed oak trees from the county highways. Waiting for a ladder truck to navigate the debris-choked streets would take at least 20 minutes. I didn't have 20 minutes to spare. The heavy, stuttering wail was echoing off the wet brick walls of the alleyway, vibrating against my ribs, demanding immediate attention. I reached for the hydraulic control panel mounted in the bucket. My thick rubber lineman gloves made finesse difficult, but after 12 years, operating the boom was pure muscle memory. I pushed the primary joystick forward, and the diesel engine of my utility truck whined in response as the hydraulic pressure increased. The fiberglass bucket dropped smoothly toward the wet asphalt. As soon as I was low enough, I unclipped the heavy steel carabiner of my safety harness from the anchor point. I needed to access the roof of the municipal building, and the fastest way was to use my own equipment. The municipal hall was a heavy, square, 3-story structure built from dark red brick back in the late 1920s. It had a flat, expansive roof surrounded by a low parapet wall, lined with copper flashing that had long since oxidized to a dull green. I shifted the truck's controls, maneuvering the heavy vehicle tight against the alley wall. The thick rubber tires scraped harshly against the concrete curb. Once the outriggers were firmly planted, I engaged the extending arm, lifting the bucket straight up the side of the windowless brick wall. The boom groaned under the strain, extending to its absolute maximum vertical reach. I brought the edge of the fiberglass bucket to hover just inches over the top of the brick parapet. I stepped out of the bucket, swinging my heavy leather work boots over the low brick wall, and dropped onto the roof. The surface was covered in thick, sun-baked tar that hadn't fully cooled despite the torrential rain of the storm. My heavy soles sank slightly into the surface, sticking with a soft, tearing sound every time I shifted my weight. The smell hit the back of my throat instantly. It was a thick, suffocating, industrial mixture of hot asphalt, damp, crumbling mortar, and decades of accumulated pigeon guano turning to sludge in the humidity. It was pitch black up here, save for the narrow, piercing beam of the heavy-duty LED headlamp strapped to my hard hat. The beam cut through the heavy, oppressive air, illuminating millions of tiny, suspended water droplets that hung in the mist left behind by the derecho. In the dead center of the expansive roof, elevated on a thick, square concrete pedestal, sat the Thunderbolt Siren. Up close, the sound was absolutely agonizing. It was no longer just a loud noise. It was a completely hostile physical environment. My chest cavity vibrated with every single rotation of the heavy iron chopper spinning inside the metal housing. I could feel the invisible sound waves pressing against my skin, a rhythmic heavy pressure that made it difficult to draw a full breath. The air itself felt thick and weaponized. I walked slowly toward the base of the concrete pedestal, my boots fighting the sticky grip of the wet tar. I am a pragmatist. I believe in cause and effect. I needed to prove Boyd right, or I needed to prove him wrong. I needed to see the copper wiring with my own two eyes. I circled the thick concrete base, shining the beam of my headlamp on the heavy PVC electrical conduit that was supposed to feed the control box mounted to the side of the Siren's iron housing. The beam of bright white light caught the pipe, casting a long, stark shadow across the concrete. Boyd wasn't just right, he was entirely accurate in the most literal sense. The thick gray PVC pipe had been sawed completely in half, leaving a jagged, empty gap of about 6 inches between the feed line and the motor housing. I leaned in close, forcing myself to ignore the deafening mechanical roar that was currently vibrating through my skull and rattling my teeth. I shone my light directly into the exposed end of the pipe, leading up to the Siren's 3-phase motor. It was completely empty. The thick, heavy-gauge copper wires inside had been snipped clean away, pushed deep back into the pipe, and capped off with ancient, brittle black electrical tape that was currently flaking apart into dust with age. There was no power source. None. I traced the empty, severed conduit with my thick rubber glove, my mind violently struggling to process the visual evidence against the auditory assault currently deafening me. An electric motor does not spin without electricity. It is a fundamental, unbreakable law of thermodynamics. You cannot generate mechanical force from nothing. The heavy iron rotor inside that housing required a massive amount of torque to overcome the static friction of 40 years of rust. I stepped back, looking up at the massive yellow horn. The metal was heavily pitted, streaked with dark brown oxidation, pointing blindly out toward the dark eastern ridge of the valley. If there was no electricity turning the massive motor inside that housing, then the heavy iron rotor was being driven entirely by air pressure. An immense, sustained, high-pressure updraft. I placed my gloved hand flat against the side of the thick concrete pedestal. The vibration traveling through the rough stone was immense, but the direction of the kinetic force was completely wrong. The vibration wasn't coming from the heavy machinery and transferring downward into the roof structure. It was coming up from the roof, traveling vertically through the concrete pillar and feeding directly into the machine. As I stood there with my hand pressed against the vibrating concrete, the Siren stuttered again. The heavy iron rotor slammed against its own momentum. I could hear the massive internal gears grinding, screaming in metallic protest as the machine slowed down for a fraction of a second before accelerating violently. The pitch dropped, warped, and shaped the massive air displacement once more. Ooh. PP. EE. Open it. Nausea spiked hard and fast in my gut. A sudden, cold wave of absolute sickness that had absolutely nothing to do with my physical exhaustion. My brain instantly scrambled for a logical, physical explanation, desperately trying to force the impossible data into a rational framework. Wind shear catching the inside of the horn? Acoustic pareidolia amplified by severe stress and sleep deprivation? The human brain is hardwired to find recognizable patterns in random noise. It desperately wants to hear familiar voices in the static. But this was not random white noise. The air on the roof was dead still after the passing of the storm front. The sound was deliberate. It was purely mechanical, but it was being manipulated by something that clearly understood phonetics. I took a step back from the pedestal, my right hand instinctively dropping to the heavy leather tool belt strapped around my waist. I unclipped my 2-foot solid steel monkey wrench. It weighed a solid 8 pounds, forged from drop-hardened steel, designed to loosen heavy industrial bolts. If the rotor was being driven by an impossible updraft of compressed air, I could stop it mechanically. I could apply physical friction to a moving part and force it to halt. That was physics. That was a rule I understood, and it was a rule I could enforce. I approached the blower intake grate at the base of the Siren unit. The suction here was incredible, a localized, powerful vacuum that actively pulled the loose fabric of my heavy canvas work pants toward the rusted iron bars. I gripped the thick, knurled steel handle of the wrench with both of my insulated rubber gloves. I planted my heavy boots wide on the sticky, wet tar, bracing my core, and shoved the heavy steel tool straight into the intake grate, aiming directly for the spinning iron teeth of the internal rotor. The wrench slid smoothly through the gaps in the grate. There was a horrific, ear-splitting metallic scream as the hardened steel handle caught the rapidly spinning iron teeth. The heavy rotor seized immediately. The entire yellow iron housing violently shuddered, groaning and twisting against the sudden, catastrophic blockage. The deafening, oppressive bass vanished in an instant. The sound simply stopped. I let out a ragged breath I hadn't realized I was holding, the sudden, absolute silence ringing in my ears like a physical pressure. I kept my grip on the wrench, leaning over and shining my headlamp into the intake grate to inspect the damage, expecting to see the iron rotor teeth shattered against my steel tool. Then, the thick concrete roof beneath my boots heaved. It was a single, sharp, incredibly violent jolt, like a massive sledgehammer striking the underside of the roof deck directly beneath the pedestal. The air pressure around the concrete pillar spiked instantly, popping my eardrums so hard it brought hot water to my eyes. With a sound exactly like a high-caliber gunshot echoing across the dark roof, the 2-foot solid steel wrench snapped completely in half inside the housing. The broken, jagged end of the heavy steel handle was violently spat out of the intake grate. It whistled past my left ear, a deadly blur of heavy metal, and embedded itself over an inch deep into the solid brick parapet wall 10 feet behind me. A shower of pulverized brick dust rained down onto the wet tar. The heavy iron rotor instantly spun back up, reaching its maximum revolutions per minute in a fraction of a second, entirely bypassing the normal spin-up time required by the laws of inertia. But the sound had changed. It was no longer a groaning, stuttering approximation of human speech. The pitch dropped so incredibly low that it rattled the fillings in my back teeth and physically blurred my vision. The massive yellow horn, which had been locked tightly in place by 40 years of rust, weather, and neglect, suddenly let out a deafening, metallic shriek as its internal gears were forced to turn. It rotated a full 90 degrees on its vertical axis. The rusted, gaping mouth of the horn stopped its rotation, pointing directly at my chest. The mechanical voice did not stutter this time. It surged through the massive yellow horn, riding a highly compressed, physical wave of air that hit my chest like a solid blow from a heavy beam. Do. Nu. Stu. Do not stop. I stumbled backward, my boots catching on a raised, sticky tar seam, and fell hard onto my back. The acoustic vibration was so intense that my vision doubled, the dark world around me splitting into two overlapping, violently vibrating images. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, and ran blindly for the edge of the roof in the safety of my bucket truck. This wasn't a broken machine, and it wasn't the wind. The decommissioned siren was acting as a megaphone for whatever was breathing beneath the concrete. I practically threw myself over the edge of the rough brick parapet, my heavy leather work boots slamming hard into the fiberglass floor of the elevated bucket. I did not wait to secure my safety harness. I slapped my thick rubber glove against the hydraulic descent lever, shoving it as far forward as the mechanism would physically allow. The diesel engine of my utility truck down in the alleyway roared in response, and the boom began to retract and lower, carrying me away from the agonizing, oppressive acoustic weight of the roof. The descent felt entirely too slow. Above me, the massive yellow horn of the Thunderbolt siren continued to scream, but it was no longer forming words. Having delivered its impossible, hostile directive, the heavy iron rotor had settled into a continuous, deafening, low-frequency drone that rattled the steel tools hanging from my belt and vibrated the fluid in my eyes. I kept my gaze locked on the brick wall sliding past me as I descended, my mind racing in a frantic, desperate circle, trying to force what had just happened into a framework of mechanical logic that made even a fraction of sense. The wrench had snapped. 2 feet of drop-forged, hardened steel, designed to withstand hundreds of pounds of human torque, had been sheared completely in half by a sudden, catastrophic spike in air pressure. And that air pressure was not coming down from the sky. It was blowing straight up from the center of the building, utilizing the hollow concrete pedestal as a massive, vertical wind tunnel. The bucket finally hit its resting cradle on the back of the truck with a heavy metallic thud. I scrambled over the lip, my boots hitting the wet asphalt of the alleyway. The high brick walls on either side of me acted as an echo chamber, trapping the low-frequency drone of the siren and bouncing it back and forth until the very air felt thick and heavy. I leaned against the cold, wet steel of my truck's utility bed, forcing myself to take 3 deep, slow breaths of the humid summer air. My hands were shaking. It was a subtle tremor, but it was there, vibrating through the thick rubber of my 10,000-volt lineman gloves. I reached up to my shoulder and twisted the volume dial on my radio back until it clicked on. The immediate burst of static was a welcome, normal sound. "Boyd," I said, pressing the transmit toggle. My voice sounded thin and strained to my own ears. "Boyd, are you there?" "Jesus Christ, Warren." Boyd's voice snapped back almost instantly, completely devoid of its usual cynical drawl. He sounded genuinely panicked, the audio clipping slightly as he spoke too loudly into his dispatcher microphone. "Do not ever cut your radio like that again. I was 10 seconds away from rolling a black and white to your location. What the hell is happening over there? The grid monitoring software is fluctuating wildly on the municipal block. It's showing massive resistance spikes, but there's no corresponding power draw. It makes absolutely no sense." "The grid is fine," I replied, staring at the heavy steel side door of the municipal building. The transformer replacement was successful. The streetlights are on. But you were right about the roof mount. The conduit is physically severed. There is no copper feeding that 3-phase motor. The rotor is being driven entirely by an updraft. "An updraft?" Boyd repeated, the confusion evident in his voice. "Warren, what are you talking about? It's a dead, humid night. There isn't enough wind in this valley to spin a pinwheel, let alone a 2-ton iron chopper." "It is not coming from the sky, Boyd," I said, my eyes tracking the path of the building's architecture from the roofline down to the concrete foundation. The air is coming up from inside the pedestal. It's blowing up from the foundation of the building. I am going into the basement. Warren, wait, do not. I released the toggle, cutting him off, but I left the radio volume on. I unclipped a heavy, high-lumen tactical flashlight from my belt and walked away from the idling utility truck. The side entrance to the borough hall was a heavy, windowless steel security door designed to keep out vandals and the weather. As the chief municipal lineman, I carried a master key ring that granted me access to every utility closet, substation, and maintenance basement in the county. I found the right brass key by touch, shoved it into the heavy deadbolt, and turned. The lock clicked heavily, and I pulled the steel door open. Stepping inside the building was like crossing the threshold into another dimension. The heavy steel door swung shut behind me, cutting off the echoing roar of the siren in the alleyway, replacing it with a thick, muffled, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. The hallway smelled exactly like every old municipal building in the country, a stale, institutional mixture of heavy chemical floor wax, damp cinder block, and the faint metallic tang of aging iron water pipes. The main power was still flickering as the newly restored grid stabilized, so the corridor was illuminated only by the harsh, dual-beam emergency lights mounted high on the plaster walls, casting long, distorted, overlapping shadows down the length of the linoleum floor. I bypassed the main lobby and headed straight for the heavy fire door at the end of the hall, clearly marked with a faded plastic sign that read, "Utility Sub-Level, Authorized Personnel Only." I pushed through it and began my descent down the narrow, switchback concrete stairwell. With every step I took downward, the physical sensation of vibration grew stronger. It was a deep, rhythmic tremor, something massive and heavy displacing the earth far below the foundation. It felt like standing directly over a subway tunnel as a train passes, but the rhythm was entirely wrong. It was halting, stuttering, and deeply organic. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped out into the utility basement. It was a massive, sprawling subterranean cavern that served as the central nervous system for the entire municipal block. It was a chaotic, industrial labyrinth of thick cast-iron water mains, asbestos-wrapped boiler pipes, and heavy steel ventilation ducts suspended from the low concrete ceiling. I unspooled the beam of my flashlight, the bright white circle cutting through the dusty, humid air. I systematically moved past the modern installations. In 2015, the county had spent $500,000 upgrading the primary switchboards, installing rows of sleek, gray digital breaker panels with LCD readouts and automated fail-safes. I ignored them completely. The digital systems had nothing to do with a mechanical siren decommissioned during the Reagan administration. I navigated deeper into the basement, moving toward the far eastern wall, where the original mid-century grid architecture was still housed. It was a section of the basement sectioned off by heavy, rusted chain-link fencing. Inside the enclosure sat the old, analog switchgear, massive slate-gray iron cabinets filled with heavy copper bus bars, manual throw switches the size of a man's forearm, and thick glass fuses. I swept my flashlight beam across the ceiling above the enclosure until I found what I was looking for. Rising directly up from the heavy concrete slab of the floor, passing straight through the basement ceiling, was a massive, square concrete pillar. It was at least 4 feet thick on each side. I recognized the placement immediately. It was the exact architectural support column that terminated on the roof above, the pedestal that the Thunderbolt siren was bolted to. I approached the chain-link fence, my eyes tracing the surface of the concrete pillar. Bolted directly to the face of the column was a heavy, rusted iron breaker box. The stenciled white paint on the metal door was faded and peeling, but still legible. Roof mount, civil defense. The heavy iron throw switch on the side of the box was locked in the open, or off, position. It was secured by a heavy, oxidized brass padlock. Hanging from the shackle of the padlock, secured by a brittle, yellowed piece of twine, was a heavy cardstock maintenance tag, It was covered in a thick layer of gray dust. I didn't bother trying to pick the lock. I reached to my belt, pulled a heavy pair of insulated wire snips, and clamped the hardened steel jaws around the brass shackle. I squeezed the handles with both hands, applying maximum leverage. The old brass snapped with a sharp ping, and the padlock clattered heavily to the concrete floor. I reached through the chain link, grabbed the heavy cardstock tag, and pulled it free, snapping the brittle twine. I wiped the decades of accumulated grime off the face of the card with the thumb of my rubber glove, holding it up to the beam of my flashlight. The ink was faded to a dull purple, written in the sharp, precise architectural block lettering of an old-school engineer. Date: October 14, 1983. Technician: M. Vance, lead acoustic engineer. Notes: primary seismic resonance dampener taken completely offline. The three-phase electric motor has catastrophically burned out attempting to match the shifting underground frequency. Do not attempt to restore electrical power to this unit. Do not open the primary vertical vent shaft. The acoustic dampening grid has failed. Let the bedrock settle naturally. God help us if it shifts pitch again. I stared at the faded ink, reading the words 3 times over, my logical, pragmatic mind violently wrestling with the terminology. Seismic resonance dampener. They hadn't built a civil defense siren. They had built an industrial-scale acoustic valve. My understanding of physics began to rapidly assemble the terrifying puzzle pieces. Sound is just a pressure wave traveling through a medium, whether that medium is air, water, or solid rock. If you have a wave that is peaking, and you introduce a second, identical wave that is troughing at the exact same frequency, the two waves physically cancel each other out, reducing the kinetic energy to zero. It is the exact same fundamental principle utilized by active noise-canceling headphones, just scaled up to a massive, terrifying geographical degree. In 1983, something buried incredibly deep in the bedrock beneath this valley had started vibrating. It was generating a massive, low-frequency seismic wave that threatened to shake the town's infrastructure apart. The county engineers hadn't used the massive roof siren to warn the citizens. They had heavily modified it to fight back. They had used the siren's massive mechanical rotor to generate a specific, targeted counter-frequency, screaming back down into the earth to physically cancel out the underground vibration. They had turned a warning device into a weapon, and they had burned the motor out trying to keep up with an anomaly that was actively shifting its pitch. The radio clipped to my vest suddenly erupted in a burst of harsh, frantic static, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. "Warren!" Boyd's voice screamed through the speaker. He was no longer just panicked. He was in a state of absolute, unadulterated terror. The audio was heavily distorted, clipping wildly as he shouted directly into the microphone. "Warren, answer me right goddamn now!" I dropped the maintenance tag, my thumb slamming down on the transmit toggle. "I am here, Boyd. I am in the municipal basement. I found the original 1983 switchgear." "Boyd, the storm tonight, the massive power failure, it must have knocked out whatever modern digital dampening grid the county installed to replace this old equipment. The blackout woke it up." "Warren, you need to listen to me," Boyd yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I don't care about the grid anymore. You need to get back to the dispatch center. You need to get out of that building right now." "I can't leave," I said, shining my light up the massive concrete pillar. "The vibration is localized here. It's using the hollow core of this pillar like a massive wind instrument. It's pushing air up to the roof to spin the rotor mechanically." "Warren, it is not localized," Boyd screamed over the radio. Through his open microphone, I could hear a terrifying background noise. It was a deep, rhythmic, structural groaning. The concrete floor in the dispatch room is humming. My coffee mug just vibrated right off the edge of my desk and shattered into 100 pieces. The structural steel beams inside the drywall are screaming. The whole building is shaking. "Get out of the building, Boyd," I commanded, my training taking over. Evacuate immediately. Get into the parking lot, stay away from the power lines, and do not. I can't, Boyd interrupted, his voice dropping from a scream to a hoarse, terrified whisper. Warren, I can't go outside. The radio tower in the back parking lot. The old civil defense pole mount. It is spinning. My blood ran completely cold, the chill settling deep in the marrow of my bones. The massive thunderbolt on the municipal roof wasn't the only decommissioned siren in this town. There was an entire network of them, 5 massive mechanical choppers scattered across the borough, all officially taken off the grid in 1983. Through Boyd's open microphone, bleeding through the static and the structural groaning of his building, I heard it. It was faint, distorted by distance and radio compression, but it was absolutely unmistakable. It was the heavy, grinding, mechanical groan of a second massive iron rotor spinning up to maximum velocity without a single volt of electricity. It did not wail. The heavy iron teeth chopped the air, dragging, choking, and manipulating the airflow with that same impossible, deliberate precision I had just experienced on the roof. The mechanical voice warped and bent, a horrifying, grinding approximation of human speech broadcasting across the dark valley. Boo. Yi. Did. It's saying my name, Warren, Boyd whispered into the radio, his breath hitching with a sob of pure terror. It's broadcasting my name over the parking lot. It's telling me to come outside. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy concrete floor beneath my boots bucked violently. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was a massive, localized seismic shock. A loud, sharp crack, like the sound of a glacier splitting, echoed through the basement. I threw my flashlight beam down at my feet. A jagged, uneven fissure had just ripped open across the solid concrete foundation, spiderwebbing outward from the base of the central pillar. Above my head, a massive, cast-iron high-pressure water main let out a terrifying shriek as the heavy iron bolts securing its joints strained against their rusted threads. A fine mist of cold water began to spray from a buckling seal, hissing as it hit the dusty air. The thing buried deep in the bedrock wasn't just waking up from a 40-year slumber. It was actively learning. It was mapping the acoustic resonance of the town's infrastructure, using the decommissioned sirens not as a warning, but as a test. It was actively searching for the exact resonant frequency required to vibrate the concrete, steel, and brick of the borough into absolute dust. A massive, pressurized jet of freezing municipal water exploded from the ceiling directly above my head, the rusted cast-iron pipe finally giving way under the immense, unnatural strain. The water blasted downward with terrifying force, raining heavily over the old analog electrical panels and hissing violently as it struck the hot, humid, dust-choked air of the subterranean basement. I threw my forearms up to shield my face, the thick canvas of my work jacket instantly soaking through to the skin. The freezing temperature of the water was a sharp, brutal shock to my system, but it was entirely secondary to the sheer, overwhelming terror radiating from the floor beneath me. The thick concrete foundation of the borough hall was vibrating continuously now. It was no longer a series of isolated tremors. It had stabilized into a sustained, low-frequency hum that traveled straight up through the heavy rubber soles of my work boots, bypassed my muscles entirely, and settled deep into the marrow of my bones and the roots of my teeth. The voice grinding out of the siren up on the roof, and the second one currently terrorizing Boyd across town, was not a ghost. It was not a haunting, and it was not a residual echo of the past. My pragmatic, mechanical mind was finally forcing the impossible data into a terrifying logical framework. It was a purely acoustic phenomenon, a massive, localized geological frequency originating deep within the bedrock that had somehow, impossibly, developed a predatory intelligence. It was adapting to its environment. It was utilizing the massive, hollow concrete pillars and the decommissioned iron sirens not to speak to us, but to actively test the structural resonance of our infrastructure. It was blindly feeling its way through the dark, manipulating the mechanical rotors to test different wavelengths, actively searching for the exact, specific pitch required to vibrate the town's concrete, steel, and brick into absolute dust. "Boyd!" I yelled into the radio clip to my soaked vest, my voice straining to cut over the deafening roar of the bursting water main and the deep structural groaning of the building around me. "Boyd, listen to me right now. Do not go outside. Get away from the exterior walls. Get under a reinforced doorframe in the center of the building and cover your ears. Do not look at the siren in the parking lot. Warren, the glass," Boyd's voice came back, barely an audible whisper over the horrific mechanical wail bleeding through his open microphone. The sound of the siren on his end was escalating, the rotor grinding with a vicious, hungry intensity. The reinforced dispatch windows. They are bowing inward. I can see the glass warping. The frames are screaming. It's pushing the air right into the room. "Hold on!" I shouted, panic finally beginning to edge into my own voice. "Do not move, Boyd! I know how to stop it." I turned my heavy tactical flashlight back to the rusted 1983 breaker panel inside the chain link enclosure. I wiped a thick layer of wet gray dust and splashing water off the faded schematic tape to the inside of the metal cage door. If the original county engineers had successfully utilized the massive Thunderbolt siren as a seismic dampener 40 years ago, there had to be a physical, mechanical method to lock the frequency in place. I traced the faded purple architectural lines with my wet glove, searching the dense block of technical text for any operational instructions. My flashlight beam highlighted a small, bolded paragraph at the bottom right corner of the yellowed cardstock. Override protocol. To achieve total phase cancellation and neutralize the primary subsurface anomaly, the mechanical stator governor on the roof unit must be manually locked into the fully open position. The rotor must be forced to maintain a continuous, uninterrupted 4,200 revolutions per minute. Warning: bypassing the governor will generate extreme acoustic pressure at the point of origin. Close proximity to the active unit without heavy industrial dampening gear will cause severe, irreversible physiological trauma. The pieces clicked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The massive Derecho storm that had swept through the valley earlier tonight had knocked out the modern, digital dampening grid the county had secretly buried to keep this dormant threat unchecked. The new equipment was dead, starved of power by the blown transformers I had spent the last 18 hours trying to fix. The only weapon left to fight the frequency was the original, primitive, mechanical beast sitting up on the roof. To save the dispatch center, to save Boyd, and to stop the bedrock from tearing the entire borough apart, I had to manually force the roof siren into a continuous, canceling shriek. I had to climb back up there in the dark and force the machine to scream back at the earth. I bolted for the concrete stairwell, taking the steep steps two at a time, my heavy wet boots slipping on the worn edges. The building was actively fighting my ascent. The plaster walls of the stairwell were spiderwebbing with deep, jagged cracks, raining a continuous shower of fine white dust and crumbling mortar onto my shoulders. The heavy steel handrail bolted to the wall vibrated so violently that grabbing it burned the thick leather palms of my gloves with sheer kinetic friction. The structural groaning was deafening, a chorus of straining wood, bending steel, and cracking masonry that sounded like the hull of a massive submarine slowly collapsing under deep ocean pressure. I reached the ground floor, threw my shoulder against the heavy steel side door, and kicked it violently open into the alleyway. The atmosphere outside had completely changed in the 10 minutes I had been in the basement. It felt incredibly heavy, oppressive, and thick, exactly like the sudden crushing barometric drop right before a massive tornado touches down. The wet asphalt of the municipal parking lot was physically rippling beneath the amber streetlights, small, jagged fissures opening up near the cast iron storm drains. From every dark neighborhood nestled in the surrounding valley, the frantic, panicked howling of hundreds of dogs echoed through the humid air, creating a terrifying, chaotic symphony of animal terror. I sprinted toward my idling utility truck, the diesel engine sounding incredibly small and fragile against the overwhelming rhythmic pulsing of the earth. I scrambled up the side of the utility bed and threw myself back into the fiberglass bucket. I slammed my hand onto the heavy hydraulic lever, ignoring the safety protocols, and sent the articulating arm shooting upward at its maximum allowable speed. As the bucket rose out of the alleyway and cleared the edge of the brick parapet, the sound hit me like a solid physical wall of moving concrete. The thunderbolt siren in the center of the roof was spinning at a truly terrifying, impossible speed. The massive yellow metal horn was rotating on its vertical axis in slow, jerky, agonizing circles. The mechanical voice was no longer forming the syllables of my name. It had abandoned speech entirely. It was now emitting a rhythmic, pulsating, deafening drone, rapidly cycling through different low-frequency pitches. It was actively hunting. It was searching for the exact, specific resonant pitch that would shatter the thick concrete pedestal beneath it and collapse the entire municipal building into the basement. I stepped out of the bucket and dropped onto the soft, sticky tar of the roof. The instant my boots made contact with the surface, my vision immediately doubled. The acoustic pressure in the air was so immense that it was physically squeezing my eyeballs, distorting the lenses and completely disrupting the delicate fluid in my inner ear. My sense of balance vanished in an instant. The horizon tilted violently, and I stumbled hard, dropping to my hands and knees on the wet, filthy asphalt. Hot, thick blood immediately began to run from my nose, spotting the black tar beneath me with dark, crimson drops. The moment I moved, the massive yellow horn abruptly stopped its slow rotation. The rusted internal gears shrieked in metallic agony as the heavy bell tilted downward on its mount, aiming the dark, gaping opening directly at my chest. The pulsating drone abruptly stopped. The heavy iron rotor stuttered, drawing in a massive, terrifying breath of humid air from the lower intake vent. The suction was so powerful I could feel the wind dragging across my back. Whine! The sound wave struck me with the force of a speeding vehicle. All the breath was violently forced from my lungs in a single agonizing instant. I collapsed completely flat against the roof, my hands desperately clutching my chest. It felt exactly as if a heavy cinder block had been dropped directly onto my sternum from a great height. The acoustic weight was crushing, pinning me to the sticky tar like an insect trapped under glass. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't stand. I couldn't even turn my head. I was 30 feet away from the iron stator, completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated physical weight of the sound. The machine ground out a second word, the pitch modulating perfectly to hit the exact resonant frequency of the bones in my human skull. A blinding, white-hot pain shot straight through my temples, feeling as though long steel needles were being driven directly into my brain. I squeezed my eyes shut, gasping for air that felt too thick to inhale. My mind raced, fighting through the overwhelming agony and the crushing acoustic pressure. The override protocol required me to reach the side of the iron housing and force a steel pry bar into the mechanical governor, but I couldn't even lift my arms. The vibration was shaking the strength out of my muscles, threatening to shatter the delicate bones in my hands if I tried to push myself up against the vibrating tar. Through the haze of pain and double vision, my eyes locked on to the heavy leather tool belt strapped around my waist. Hanging from a heavy brass clip were my primary lineman gloves. They were massive, thick, heavy rubber gauntlets, specifically engineered and rigorously tested to completely insulate the human body against 10,000 volts of raw, deadly electricity. They were clumsy, they were restrictive, and they made fine motor skills nearly impossible. But they were made of dense, heavily vulcanized rubber. They wouldn't stop the deafening noise, and they wouldn't stop the crushing pressure in my chest. But the thick, dense rubber insulation might just absorb enough of the direct, physical vibration to allow me to grip my steel tools and drag myself across the roof without the bones in my fingers and wrists literally shattering from the kinetic force. It was a desperate, theoretical leap of pure mechanical logic, but it was the only option I had left. I slowly, agonizingly forced my right hand down toward my belt, fighting against the crushing, invisible weight of the sound, preparing to inch my way forward into the screaming mouth of the machine. Every inch forward felt like crawling through a trench filled with deep, heavy water. The air was visibly rippling in front of the massive yellow horn, distorting the dark, overcast sky above me into a violent, shaking blur that made my stomach heave. My nose began to bleed almost immediately, hot drops of crimson spotting the black tar beneath my chin, instantly vibrating into a fine red mist the moment they struck the roof. The acoustic pressure was not merely a loud noise, it was a localized physical weight. It pressed down on my spine, my shoulders, and the back of my skull with the sheer, unyielding mass of a concrete block. I dug the reinforced steel toes of my work boots into the sticky, sun-baked asphalt, anchoring my lower body as I dragged my torso forward. My thick, heavy rubber lineman gloves were the only things keeping my hands from shattering. These gloves were my livelihood. They were designed to stop a man from being instantly incinerated by a live primary line. They were stiff, unwieldy, and stripped away almost all fine motor control, turning my hands into blunt, padded clubs. But as I pressed my palms against the vibrating tar, I felt the genius of their engineering. The thick layers of dense, heavily vulcanized rubber and leather acted as a primitive dampening field. Without them, the high-frequency vibrations traveling through the roof deck would have micro-fractured the delicate carpal bones in my wrists within seconds. I relied on them now, not to stop electricity, but to stop sound. I shoved the angled wedge of the steel pry bar into the tar, using it as an anchor to pull my dead weight forward, 6 inches. That was all I managed before the intelligence buried deep within the bedrock realized exactly what I was doing. The machine ground out a word, but it didn't broadcast it across the valley. The pitch modulated, dropping into a tight, concentrated frequency designed specifically to hit the exact resonant resonance of the human skull. A blinding, white-hot pain shot straight through my temples, feeling as though 2 long, rusted steel nails were being driven directly into the center of my brain. I squeezed my eyes shut, relying entirely on the heavy rubber of my lineman gloves and the raw, mechanical repetition of my crawling to feel my way forward. The anomaly shifted its tactic. The air pressure suddenly and violently reversed. Instead of blowing sound out across the roof, the massive intake grate at the base of the Siren sucked air in. The vacuum was immense, a localized hurricane pulling the humid night air, the loose gravel on the roof, and the heavy canvas fabric of my high-visibility vest toward the spinning iron teeth of the rotor. I flattened myself against the tar, wrapping my left arm over the back of my head to streamline my profile against the wind. The suction was terrifying, threatening to drag me across the slick, wet surface of the roof and pull me headfirst into the intake. I jammed the pry bar deep into a thick, raised seam in the roofing material, clinging to the heavy hexagonal steel shaft with every ounce of strength remaining in my right arm. It was a battle of raw physics against an impossible geological intelligence. The suction pulled at my hair, tearing the hard hat from my head and sending it clattering into the dark. I could feel the seams of my canvas jacket straining, the heavy brass zipper biting into my neck as the fabric was hauled toward the rusted iron grate. The air grew incredibly thin, the oxygen being stolen directly from my lungs by the mechanical beast. I had to time my breathing, snatching short, shallow gasps whenever the rotor stuttered and the suction briefly weakened. I was a 42-year-old utility worker, fighting a war against the bedrock of my own town, armed with nothing but a steel bar and a stubborn refusal to die. The wind was not a steady, continuous blow. It pulsed in time, with a terrifying, deep rhythm originating from the concrete foundation of the municipal building itself. The voice did not come from the massive yellow horn above me this time. It vibrated straight up my spine, traveling from the concrete roof deck through my ribs and directly into my chest cavity. It was a deep, earth-shaking command, a geological demand spoken by something that had mapped the town's infrastructure and learned how to manipulate our machinery to communicate. It wanted me to stop. It wanted me to let go of the steel bar, slide back to the edge of the parapet, and leave it alone to find the exact pitch required to bring the borough hall crashing down into the basement. I ignored it. I am a municipal lineman. I maintain the grid. I deal in load limits, copper wiring, and physical reality. I do not take orders from the dirt. The sheer arrogance of the phenomenon fueled my anger. It was using my town, my infrastructure, the very equipment I had spent over a decade maintaining, as a weapon against us. It had hijacked the decommissioned Siren, treating the heavy iron and steel like a cheap toy. It didn't understand the stubborn, deeply ingrained resilience of the men who kept the lights on. It didn't understand that when a system fails, we don't run away. We climb the pole. We find the fault. We force the system back into compliance. I tightened my grip on the pry bar, the rough steel biting through the thick leather of my inner glove, and waited for the inward pulse of the vacuum to recede for a fraction of a second. The moment the pressure dropped, I wrenched the tool free from the tar, lunged forward through the vibrating air, and threw my left arm around the base of the thick concrete pedestal. The vibration here, at the absolute epicenter of the phenomenon, was absolute. The solid stone of the pedestal felt completely liquid beneath my rubber glove. The structural rebar buried deep inside the concrete was humming with so much kinetic energy that it generated a faint, localized field of static heat. I dragged myself up against the side of the pillar, using the rough texture of the concrete to haul my battered body into a kneeling position. The governor was located on the right side of the heavy iron chopper housing, a small, rusted iron lever that controlled the internal airflow and the revolutions per minute of the three-phase motor. On a normal day, an engineer would manually adjust this lever to change the siren's wail. Right now, the underground intelligence was actively manipulating it, rapidly snapping the lever back and forth to choke and release the airflow, desperately searching for the destructive resonant pitch that would shatter the building. The heavy iron lever was moving so fast, it was nothing but a chaotic, gray blur of vibrating metal. I stared at the blurred mechanism, my mind racing through the old, faded schematics I had seen in the basement. The Thunderbolt siren was a brute force piece of engineering from an era when machines were built to survive nuclear fallout. The governor lever was held in place by a heavy, thick steel safety shear pin. If I could wedge the pry bar into the gap behind the lever and apply enough outward torque, I could snap that pin. Once the pin broke, the heavy internal spring would force the lever to slam completely forward, locking the air intake wide open. The rotor would instantly be starved of regulation. It would spin out of control, reaching its maximum theoretical velocity. It was a suicide mission for the machine, and potentially for me, but it was the only mathematical solution to the acoustic equation. I had to lock it open. I had to bypass the regulation and force the machine into a continuous, uninterrupted 4,200 RPM wail. That was the 1983 override protocol. That was the only way to achieve total phase cancellation. I raised the heavy steel pry bar in my right hand. My arm was shaking uncontrollably, the muscles spasming violently from the sustained acoustic trauma and the sheer, exhausting physical tension. I aimed the angled steel wedge for the narrow, half-inch gap behind the blurred, vibrating governor lever. If I missed, the iron lever would strike the solid steel shaft of my tool, and the kinetic kickback would instantly shatter every bone in my hand, even through the dense vulcanized rubber. The intelligence sensed the immediate threat to its mechanism. The air pressure suddenly spiked, and a massive jolt of vibration surged through the iron housing directly into my shoulder, attempting to throw my aim off. I screamed, though I couldn't hear my own voice over the deafening grinding roar of the rotor, and drove the pry bar forward with every ounce of strength I had left. The steel tip wedged perfectly into the dark gap behind the iron lever. The impact sent a horrific shockwave up my arm, but the heavy lineman glove absorbed the worst of it. The wedge was seated deep. I didn't hesitate. I threw my entire body weight to the side, violently wrenching the heavy steel bar backward, using the rusted iron housing of the Siren as a fulcrum. The physical strain was immense. My heavy work boots scrambled for traction on the wet, vibrating tar. My left arm, wrapped tightly around the concrete pedestal, burned with lactic acid. The anomaly fought back with terrifying desperation. The air around the Siren grew incredibly dense, the acoustic pressure physically pushing against my chest in a frantic attempt to dislodge me. I could feel the intelligence panicking, realizing that its primary weapon was about to be turned against it. It sent a final, massive surge of kinetic energy up through the concrete, shaking the entire roof structure in a violent, localized earthquake. But I held my ground. I clamped my jaw shut, squeezed my eyes tight against the blinding pain in my skull, and pulled backward on the pry bar with the desperate, unyielding strength of a man who refuses to be beaten by a machine. The resistance was immense, fighting against 40 years of rust and the active, malicious will of the anomaly below. There was a loud, sharp, incredibly distinct metallic snap that cut cleanly through the deafening roar. The heavy steel safety shear pin inside the governor assembly broke completely in half. The thick iron lever instantly slammed forward, locking permanently into the fully open, unregulated position. The stuttering stopped immediately. The mechanical chopper seized the sudden, unrestricted, massive influx of air, accelerating in a fraction of a second to its absolute maximum physical limit. The thunderbolt siren let out a continuous, uninterrupted, ear-splitting wail. It was the loudest sound I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was no longer a voice, no longer a command. It was pure, unadulterated, screaming mechanical fury. The counter-frequency hit the bedrock like a physical spear. For 3 absolute, terrifying seconds, the world tore itself apart. The heavy concrete roof buckled violently beneath my knees. The brick parapet wall surrounding the roof shattered outward, raining thousands of pounds of heavy red masonry down into the dark alleyway below. The 2 massive, opposing frequencies, the deep, organic, destructive hum of the underground anomaly, and the high, piercing, mechanical shriek of the unregulated siren, collided directly beneath the municipal building, fighting for dominance in a localized, catastrophic war of physics. The collision of the 2 sound waves created a zone of absolute atmospheric chaos. The air pressure fluctuated so violently that the heavy rain clouds hanging low over the valley were physically pushed back, clearing a perfect, circular patch of starry sky directly above the borough hall. The heavy steel doors of the municipal building blew outward off their hinges. The cast iron storm drains in the parking lot ruptured, sending geysers of dirty water shooting high into the air. I was caught at the exact epicenter of the cancellation event. The physical sensation was indescribable. It felt as though every single cell in my body was being simultaneously compressed and expanded at microscopic speeds. The raw kinetic energy was searching for an outlet, tearing through the brick, the steel, and the human flesh trapped on the roof. I was thrown backward, landing hard on the vibrating tar. I stared up at the dark, starry sky, completely unable to move. The acoustic pressure was absolute. I felt the delicate blood vessels in my eyes burst, painting my vision with a dark, terrifying red tint. And then, a sharp, agonizing pop echoed deep inside the center of my skull. It felt exactly as though a highly pressurized balloon had suddenly burst directly behind my eyes. A rush of warm, thick fluid spilled rapidly out of both of my ear canals, trailing hot and heavy down the sides of my neck, soaking into the collar of my canvas work jacket. And then, silence. Total, absolute, terrifying silence. The violent, bone-rattling vibration in the concrete roof instantly stopped. The heavy, oppressive, weaponized weight in the humid air vanished, leaving the atmosphere feeling light, thin, and incredibly empty. The night sky above me felt completely normal again. I lie there on the wet tar, my chest heaving as I dragged desperately needed oxygen into my burning lungs. I rolled my head slowly to the side, fighting through the intense, lingering vertigo. The massive thunderbolt siren was still sitting on its concrete pedestal. The heavy iron rotor was still spinning at a terrifying, unregulated blur. The rusted yellow horn was still vibrating violently against its mount. The machine was still screaming at the absolute top of its mechanical lungs, generating a massive, continuous, phase-canceling sound wave. But I couldn't hear a single thing. The sudden transition from deafening, catastrophic noise to absolute dead silence was more disorienting than the physical pain. I lie on the tar, watching the heavy metal horn vibrating with intense kinetic energy, watching the air rippling around the intake grate, yet the world was entirely mute. I slapped my heavy rubber glove against the tar next to my head. I felt the impact travel up my arm, but there was no corresponding sound. I opened my mouth and screamed, a raw, primal yell of pain and survival, but nothing registered in my ears. The silence was heavy, thick, and suffocating. It was the absolute, permanent absence of sound. The anomaly had been silenced, cancelled out by the mechanical fury of the siren, but it had taken my hearing with it as a final, cruel toll. My eardrums were completely, irreparably ruptured. I did not try to stand up. I simply closed my bloodshot eyes, pressed my cheek against the cold, wet, sticky tar of the municipal roof, and waited. I lie there for hours, watching the dark, starry sky slowly transition into the pale, flat, gray light of a humid summer dawn. The storm clouds finally broke, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered down into the valley. Eventually, the heavy vibrations of heavy boots on the roof reached me. I felt the rhythmic thudding through the tar before I saw them. It was a rescue crew from the county fire department. They appeared in my peripheral vision, moving cautiously across the debris-strewn roof. I saw their mouths moving rapidly, their faces twisted in expressions of shouting and urgent communication, but the world remained entirely, perfectly quiet. Two heavy-set firefighters in thick yellow turnout gear knelt beside me. One of them carefully checked the thick, dried blood caking the sides of my neck, while the other signaled frantically to someone out of my line of sight. They had to physically drag me away from the pedestal. The visual experience of the rescue was surreal, like watching a chaotic, high-stakes silent film. I saw the bright, flashing red and white lights of the emergency vehicles parked in the alleyway below, sweeping across the surrounding brick walls, but there was no accompanying wail of sirens. I saw the strained, panicked expressions of the paramedics as they strapped me onto a rigid backboard, their mouths forming urgent words that I could not decipher. I felt the heavy mechanical hum of the diesel engine as the ladder truck's hydraulic arm lowered me safely to the ground, the vibration traveling through the rigid plastic of the backboard. Before they loaded me into the back of a waiting ambulance, I watched a technician in heavy industrial ear protection brutally sever the main mechanical drive shaft of the Thunderbolt siren with a portable, gas-powered abrasive saw. The rotor finally stopped spinning. As the ambulance pulled away from the municipal building, I caught one final glimpse of the roof. The thick brick parapet was completely gone, reduced to a jagged, uneven edge. The massive yellow horn of the Thunderbolt siren sat silent and still in the pale morning light, a dead iron monument to the catastrophic war of frequencies that had just been fought. I spent the next 3 weeks in the county hospital. The medical diagnosis was exactly what I had expected: bilateral tympanic membrane rupture, accompanied by severe, irreversible sensorineural hearing loss. The acoustic trauma had completely destroyed the microscopic hair cells in my cochlea. The doctors used a small white board and a dry erase marker to explain that surgical intervention was impossible. The deafness was absolute and permanent. Boyd survived the night. The heavy reinforced glass windows at the dispatch center had completely shattered, blowing inward and covering the room in thousands of razor-sharp fragments, but the structural integrity of the building had held. The massive, destructive underground frequency was neutralized by the siren's overriding shriek just seconds before the dispatch center's foundation would have catastrophically collapsed. Boyd came to visit me in the hospital once. He looked incredibly old, his face pale and deeply lined. He sat in the chair next to my bed, wrote "thank you" on the dry erase board, set the marker down, and cried silently for 10 minutes before leaving. The town council, desperate to maintain order and avoid a widespread panic, immediately drafted a comprehensive, highly sanitized official narrative. They publicly blamed the extensive structural damage to the municipal hall, the dispatch center, and the surrounding brickwork on a localized, highly severe microquake, a rare geological event triggered by the extreme barometric pressure changes of the derecho storm. It was a neat, tidy, scientifically plausible lie. I watched the local news reports on the small television mounted in my hospital room, reading the closed captions as the town's mayor confidently assured the citizens that the danger had passed. The structural engineers were brought in to inspect the foundations, nodding sagely for the cameras and confirming the microquake theory. The broken water mains were repaired, the shattered glass was swept away, and the town slowly, methodically returned to its mundane, everyday routine. The official story was swallowed whole by the public, eager for a rational, comforting explanation. But I knew the truth. I knew what was buried beneath the town. Within a week, a heavy construction crew was contracted to deal with the roof of the borough hall. They built a massive wooden formwork around the heavy concrete pedestal and the rusted iron housing of the Thunderbolt siren. They pumped thousands of gallons of dense, industrial-grade cement into the form, completely entombing the machine, the intake vents, and the severed electrical conduit in a solid, immovable block of heavy gray concrete. They removed the yellow metal horn entirely, cutting it away with acetylene torches and hauling it off to a scrapyard. The town had chosen comfortable ignorance over terrifying reality, sealing away the evidence and pretending the nightmare had never happened. They think they solved the problem. They think that by pouring cement over the acoustic valve, they have permanently sealed the anomaly away beneath the bedrock. They believe that the danger has passed. They are entirely wrong. I am officially on permanent medical leave. I live alone in a small, single-story house on the outer edge of the valley. I exist in a silent, isolated world, completely cut off from the auditory chaos of modern infrastructure. But when you lose one primary sense, the human body adapts. Your nervous system compensates. You learn to interpret the world through different, highly sensitive avenues of physical input. I can no longer hear the wind, or the rain, or the sound of a passing utility truck, but I can feel things that I never, ever noticed before. At night, when the valley is completely still and the heavy, humid air settles over the town, I sit alone in my dark living room. I take off my heavy boots, and I press my bare feet perfectly flat against the old, polished hardwood floorboards. Most nights, the wood is dead, inert, and entirely still. But sometimes, usually around 2 a.m, when the barometric pressure drops and the air grows heavy, I feel it. It is a faint, incredibly deep, rhythmic vibration traveling up through the floor joists, bypassing the concrete foundation of my house, and resonating directly into the bones of my feet. It is a stuttering, halting, mechanical rhythm. The intelligence buried deep in the bedrock can no longer speak through the rusted iron rotors of the decommissioned sirens. Its primary megaphones have been entombed or destroyed. But it is still down there. It is still awake, it is still adapting, and it is still relentlessly testing the structural resonance of the earth itself. It is a slow, methodical process. I can feel it testing the density of the limestone, mapping the vast network of aquifers, and tracing the buried fault lines that run beneath the valley. It is no longer relying on our discarded machinery to communicate. It is learning how to speak through the geology itself. It is discovering how to vibrate the bedrock with enough precision to form consonants, to shape vowels, to articulate its malicious intent directly through the earth. I sit in the absolute silence of my living room, feeling the faint rhythmic tremors vibrating through the hardwood, and I realize the terrifying, undeniable truth. It is practicing syllables in the dirt. It is learning new words,